and Barbuda, we have Nice FM Radio and ABS Radio. In the Commonwealth of Dominica, Q95 and Carry FM. In Grenada, WIFM Radio, Classic FM 105.5, and Sister Isles Radio 92.9. In Montserrat, we have Radio ZJB, Radio Montserrat. In St. Christopher and Nevis, WINN FM, Vaughan Radio, Freedom FM, and ZIZ Television. In St. Lucia, we have Rhythm FM and WVent 93.5, 94.7 FM. And in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, NBS Radio, WFM Radio, and Nice Radio. For rebroadcast in Anguilla, Class FM Radio would be on Thursday. This is today at 8 p.m. So that's today at 8 p.m., Class FM in Anguilla. In the Commonwealth of Dominica, DBS Radio on Tuesday, the 16th of March at 9:30 p.m. And in St. Christopher and Nevis, Freedom FM Radio, Thursday, 11 March, which is today at 1:30 p.m. So Freedom in St. Kitts will be 1:30 p.m. today. So I want to thank all of our broadcast partners who have joined us again for this very important dialogue. And I do want to express congratulations to ZIZ Radio and Television, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary of broadcasting. Kudos to you at ZIZ. So with that, I'd now like to introduce our panel. If you're joining us for the first time, this is ECCB Digital Dialogues, and today our focus is on pandemic and climate resilience. We have a wonderful team lined up, and I'm so grateful that they've made the time to be able to assist us today. I'd like to start with Dr. James Fletcher, a former minister in the government of St. Lucia. His portfolios included climate, energy, science and technology, among others. Dr. Fletcher is very well known in our region and elsewhere. He played a pivotal role in the work of our region in the lead up to the Paris Accord in 2015. A lot of work. And those of you who recall the slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. Dr. Fletcher, good morning and welcome to you.
Thank you, Governor. Good morning. Great to be here and thanks for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to today's session.
Great, thank you. And of course, the bios are on our Facebook page. I'm only giving you a little sample. You can get much more on the bios of our panelists from our Facebook page. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Stephanie Gill. Ms. Gill is a practice manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. She leads work on energy and extractives in the global practice. She is the lead on energy sector engagement, regulatory reforms, disruptive technologies, new finance and architecture, among others. Mrs. Gill is a Spanish and French national, an energy specialist who brings private sector experience. She worked with one of the big utilities in France, EDF, and of course, she brings significant experience to the role. And Ms. Gill, Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you very much, Governor, and it is a pleasure to be joining this digital dialogue together with my distinguished fellow panelists, Dr. Fletcher and Mr. Gomes. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Very, very good. And Stephanie told me a little earlier that the last time she traveled was actually in February last year to St. Kitts. And since then, she has been hunkered down, well, for a long time in her basement in DC. We look forward to the day when she will emerge and we will see her again in person. But thanks again for joining us. Really happy to have you on board. And then we have our very own, in a sense. Of course, Dr. Fletcher is also very own. David Gomes, who is originally from Anguilla. David is actually at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a nonprofit that works on essentially delivering or helping to deliver a zero carbon world. A zero carbon world. At Rocky Mountain Institute, David is the lead or the principal for Africa, Islands, and the Southeast Asia program. He specializes in building resiliency and reducing energy costs through renewable energy microgrids. Before joining RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, he was in his own business, private sector. And before that, and many of you will be familiar with that role. He was the CEO of Anguilla Electricity Company, ANGLEC. David, Mr. Gums, welcome.
Thank you so much, Governor. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, have this very timely and very applicable discussion to the Eastern Caribbean nations. And I'm happy
very, very good.
Part of the panel.
Very good. Thank you very much. And as always, we not only have experts, but we have a gender balance. If you notice our dialogues, we try to have that as well. And we, I'm very grateful to the panelists. So without any further ado, let's get to the questions. For those of you who join us for the first time, the dialogue has 3 segments. The first is the moderator will pose direct questions to the panel. Second is where we check in on the audience poll. And the third and final segment is the Q&A, where we actually pull the questions and we get responses. So let's move to our panel and to the questions. Segment 1. In 2019, the ECCU fuel import bill was $1.2 billion. As you can tell, this represents significant leakage in terms of foreign exchange. Of course, not only do we spend significant sums on energy, but it has a direct cost on doing business. Doing business, the cost of doing business is high, and it also reflects in a relatively low ranking on the Ease of Doing Business Index, which is an annual publication of the World Bank. So, as I said earlier, our share of renewables in our energy mix is low. For the ECCU, it's probably around 10%. That's the number that we have. And so clearly, there is significant work to do to accelerate our region's renewable energy transition. More than that, we want to cut our carbon emissions. We want to save foreign exchange. We want to build resilience, and we want to, of course, create shared prosperity and energy security. So I'm going to start with Dr. Fletcher. Jimmy, a year ago, the world's attention pivoted sharply to the biological threat of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, it seems that climate emergency that was confronting us has somewhat faded in light of the pressures of the pandemic. So I'd like to ask you to bring us back to the still urgent and existential threat that is climate change, and ask you, what is this 1.5 to stay alive? That famous mantra or slogan that you led so well in 2015. And why is it important for our region at this time to focus on this issue of climate resilience? Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Governor, for that question. And before I start, I'd just like to say that, like Stephanie, the last time I traveled was to the Growth and Resilience Forum in St Kitts last year. So we have that in common. Well, maybe the best way to answer that question, Governor, is to look at that nexus of COVID-19 and climate change. It's not one that readily people think of, but last year, because of COVID-19, you had these unprecedented global shutdowns. Every economy of the world, starting with China, which is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide globally, and every other major economy, the United States, all the European countries, the United Kingdom, Canada, they all shut down in order to curb the spread of this virus. As a result, you had something happening last year that was historic. Global carbon emissions fell by 7% last year. That's quite significant. That's the equivalent of 2.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide not getting into the atmosphere. 2.6 gigatons that would normally be emitted as a result of the industrial processes taking place around the world. You would think then that because 2.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide did not get into the atmosphere, and we know carbon dioxide is one of the major greenhouse gases, together with methane that you get from livestock and nitrous oxide that you get from landfills and also from fertilizer use, that maybe this relentless warming of our planet would have abated last year, but it wasn't. 2020 was actually tied with 2016 for the hottest year on record. So despite this 7% drop in greenhouse gas emissions, we still had our planet increasing, the temperature of our planet increasing by almost 1 degree Celsius. So when we speak of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're actually saying that, and the science has proven this, there was a report that was commissioned by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we asked for in 2015 when we signed the Paris, when we adopted the Paris Agreement. We said that there needed to be rigorous, robust scientific data to prove why 1.5 was such an important threshold for small island developing states. And we are now 2/3 of the way to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Our planet has warmed by 1 degree Celsius. And that is quite ominous for small island developing states, low-lying countries, and other climate vulnerable countries. The consequence of that is our polar ice caps. The ice caps at the North Pole and at the South Pole are melting at an alarming rate. And in fact, the temperature increases we're seeing in the North Pole, the Arctic Circle, are actually higher than what we're seeing globally. So last year, for example, I'm sure that this is a joke that you get universally, that when you say that you're banishing someone, you say that you send them to Siberia, because Siberia is known to have the harshest, coldest conditions on the planet. In June last year, Siberia, a town in Siberia, recorded a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, let that sink in. We have never, at least not in my living history, have we seen 100 degrees Fahrenheit in any one of our Caribbean islands. Siberia, a town in Siberia, recorded 100 degrees Fahrenheit last year. In the Antarctic, we saw record temperatures in February last year of almost 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That is warm. Those are places where you should not be able to venture, even with full clothing and everything else. So the temperature at our poles is warming alarmingly. And as a result, we have now sea level rise taking place at a level that's even greater than we thought. In 2019, the data showed that the ice melting in Greenland was what we thought would be a worst case scenario by the year 2070. So it means we're 50 years ahead of schedule for what the models had predicted would be sea level rise and ice warming. That is quite alarming. So for countries like ours, low-lying countries, climate vulnerable countries, that has very ominous implications, because, you know, our economic and social juggler is near the coast. All of our economic infrastructure is near the coast. Our power plants, our roads, our schools, our hospitals, everything that is of economic significance to us is located near the coast in the Caribbean. So consider what impact a 1 meter sea level rise, which is the best case scenario that we're looking at, what that will mean for St. Kitts, for St. Lucia, for Anguilla, for Antigua and Barbados, which are very low-lying, what that will mean for them. What we're also seeing is disruptions to the water cycle. So we're seeing rainfall that is very unpredictable. And it's not just in small island developing states. Right now, half of the United States is experiencing one of the worst droughts ever. Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, all of them are right now in the throes of a very severe drought. So climate change is not just something that small island developing states are at the forefront of. The entire world is experiencing climate change. Warmer ocean and land temperatures. Warmer ocean temperatures means more devastating hurricanes, stronger hurricanes. So what we saw in 2017 with Irma and Maria will now become more commonplace. Hurricanes moving from a Cat 1 to a Cat 5 in 24 hours. Ocean acidification, our oceans absorbing more carbon dioxide and now getting more acidic. And they actually found that in the Pacific Ocean is getting so acidic now that the shells of some Dungeness crabs are actually starting to dissolve, because you need more alkaline conditions, less acidic conditions for calcification of a lot of your seafood. So those that like lobster and shrimp that depend on a hard shell, they can't form these shells in acidic conditions. So there are impacts on food security, impacts on water security. So really we are heading in a direction that is not a good one. And you know, it's a living system. So it's not a linear thing. It's not that, okay, if this happens, that happens. There's a positive feedback mechanism that takes place. And that's why the models that we have are not even predicting what is taking place right now, because as things start to happen, there's a cascade effect. So all of this, to give you a short answer to your question, 1.5 degrees is the threshold that we've set. But even before we get to 1.5, as I've shown that we're not even at 1.5, we're only at 1 degree, we're already seeing some devastating impacts. So yes, COVID took our minds away from climate change as a clear and present danger, because COVID represented an even more clear and more present danger. But climate change is not abating. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that the emission reductions that we saw last year have started rebounding. So China actually recorded a 0.8% increase in global emissions because once they got the virus under control, they ramped up their industrial processes. December 2020 saw the United States get its emissions back to previous levels. And that's why this dialogue is so important, that we cannot go back to business as usual. We have to now go on a new development trajectory that is low carbon. Otherwise, yes, we may deal with COVID, we may have the vaccines going and get to some level of health normalcy. But what will happen is that this climate crisis will spiral very quickly out of control. So we must now move to a low carbon development pathway, which is what I hope that, I'm sure that we will discuss during this dialogue.
Right. Dr. Fletcher, I really thank you for that. That was a great overview and introduction, a reminder of the situation and this crisis. And of course, I will merely add that we're being told that as a result of the climate crisis, we might actually be seeing more pandemics. So if we think this is bad, beware. So thanks for that. Very sobering indeed. Which leads me to ask Ms. Gill. Stephanie, now that Dr. Fletcher has made the environmental case for building climate resilience, speak to us, if you will, about the economic arguments for a green agenda in the Caribbean and around the world.
Thank you very much, Governor. And I have to say that from my perspective, the climate impact should be sufficient on their own. The economic arguments simply add to the common sense of what should be really proceeding forwards. And I think given that globally, energy either as a fuel for electricity generation or as a fuel for transport is a key contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, it really brings into perspective the need to move to a clean energy transition very quickly. The economic crisis, I think, carries specific significance, I think, in the context of the Caribbean. We see that, I was looking back at some of the numbers, the economic crisis for the Caribbean countries have brought a contraction in GDP of about 9.8% for 2020. So there is really now an opportunity to look at a different model for growth, one that is not funded on fossil fuels, and that is really contributing to a more resilient and more sustainable model. I think I would like to make three arguments for this clean energy transition. The first one is, I think, very, very obvious. And it is the fact that, as you've laid out, Governor, in your introductory remark, investments in renewable energy and in other forms of clean energy, such as energy efficiency to reduce consumption through cleaner cooling, reduce the cost of electricity, and reduce electricity bills. Currently, as you laid out, most of the electricity is generated from fossil fuels, from imported fossil fuels. What this means is that electricity tariffs in the region are 3 to 4 times higher than, for instance, that of the United States. We're looking at tariffs in the range of 30 to 40 cents per kilowatt hour. And in the United States, where I'm living at the moment, so it is in the range, it's broadly 10. Let's make exception for exceptional events such as what we witnessed in Texas a few weeks ago. But we have overall tariffs, electricity tariffs that are 3 to 4 times more expensive than in the United States because of this import of fossil fuels. And on the other hand, we have nations that have a wealth of potential for renewable energy that is proven. Our colleagues, for instance, from the Rocky Mountain Institute, I'm aware, have been involved in identifying such potential in solar, in wind, in geothermal. There are many resources that are available locally. And the cost of developing such resources have fallen drastically over the past 2 decades, to the point that we can see that, for instance, for solar energy, admittedly at utility scale, we're reaching very low single-digit cents per kilowatt hour, so about 1/10 of the tariff that we're observing currently in many of the Caribbean countries. If I give another example, in 2019 and 2020, Hawaii secured some solar plants with battery storage at a cost of 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, to contrast with the 30 to 40 cents per per kilowatt hour tariff. So the technologies are maturing and they can bring this strong reduction in cost. And this, as you headlined yourself, is particularly critical in the context of affordability and also of better competitiveness of the economy. So I think this is a first simple cost-based argument. A second argument, which I think you already highlighted, Governor, which goes beyond this affordability competitiveness component, is the fact that we're looking currently at a very strong bill of imported fossil fuels, which weigh on the trade balance of the countries, which weigh on the foreign exchange reserves that are required. And you can imagine that it would, of course, also be a very substantial positive impact on the economy of the region if the trade balance could be rebalanced, avoiding the need for such large imports of fossil fuels, and if also the cost of carrying foreign exchange reserves could be reduced accordingly. And I think if you think of some of the technologies, there's a very positive impact if we think of, for instance, the development of electric mobility. Electric mobility, where your electricity is generated from the same fossil fuel that you're currently using for your car, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But once you start shifting towards renewable energy for electricity production, then it makes sense to power your car with electricity as well. And the third and final point that I would like to make on the economic arguments, and it's again consistent with this shift of the economy, is the very high potential for local job creation that would arise from shifting to a greener growth model, a more sustainable, more resilient growth model founded on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Two data points that I would like to quote. So a recent study by Joseph Stiglitz, the economic Nobel laureate, showed that green investment has some of the higher economic multiplier effects on the economy. So it really makes a good sense to invest in clean energy. And the second study from a think tank in Canada that also highlighted that $1 million invested in energy efficiency can create 30 to 40 net new local jobs in an economy, while reducing your electricity bill, reducing the need for fossil fuel imports. So I think, again, I would like to reiterate that to me, the message of the climate impact and the reduction of emissions is key. It should be the critical driver. In addition, it also makes strong economic sense to shift to a green, renewable energy, energy efficiency recovery model for resilience and for sustainable growth. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for those economic arguments so well and clearly laid out and illustrated. Just to say that for the ECCU, our contraction last year was 14%, 1-4. So it's even higher than the average of 9% for the region. And that, of course, is directly tied to our tourism dependence. I think the other point, key takeaway, is the possibility of jobs. And you mentioned that a while ago in this transition. And that's very important given the high unemployment rate in some parts of our region, especially among our youth. So perhaps we pick that up again as we go. So thank you, Stephanie. Let me now turn to David Gums. And David, you know, you've been listening to your colleagues, and I suppose the question is, how do we accelerate the energy transition to reduce emissions and to create the resilience that we need? In the past, some Caribbean countries have attempted to develop renewable energies, energy sources, I should say, but there have been some challenges. Speak, if you will, to some of these initiatives and some of the issues that have arisen with past efforts at renewable energy development.
Thank you, Governor, and thanks for the great, excellent points that my colleagues have made. I think they've covered a host of points, from the economics of this to the environmental impact that this will have. You know, at RMI tries to be the sort of lever to help catalyze the transition to renewable energy or zero carbon operating environment. And I think the pathway to get there has been rough and rugged over the years. Past initiatives in the Caribbean region, you know, there's been a steady hand at hydro over many years, particularly in Dominica, St. Vincent, and some of the countries in the region that That's sort of base load has been there for many years and proven. The other areas, of course, that are being explored by Dominica and St. Vincent and St. Lucia is geothermal. That's a project that's heavily supported by the World Bank and a number of other international organizations. That in itself has been a challenge because geothermal has some level of risk associated with, successfully not only finding the resource, but finding a resource sufficient enough to generate, sufficient capacity to make it efficient and economical. Then there's a high cost associated with it. So that's where one of the challenges, some of the challenges lay in the transition. But if you look at geothermal, that's limited to just a few volcanic type islands where you have enough potential. So you have to turn to wind, let's say, and you turn to wind. And wind is a little more complex because there are a number of critical studies that need to happen, both in assessing your wind resource and siting the various wind plants. However, once done, and if you have the appropriate resource that could generate the energy, you're faced with a high upfront capital cost that is a little prohibitive. Now, if done and done successfully, it works very well. It's pretty steady. It's continuous. However, in the Caribbean region, we do have a risk of hurricane impact that we'd have to mitigate by design and sort of design of the plant and design of your location. Beyond that, though, there is the solar. The potential with solar has been one that has been challenged in the past, but I must say today it's a pretty straightforward and more simplistic look at the transition. And I'd say that because the biggest barrier with solar in the past has been the price point. And over the last 10 years, we've seen 80-90% drop in the price of solar PV panels. And with that said, there's hardly anything else you could compare it to. That's a significant decrease. In addition to the decrease in price, you've seen a tremendous increase in the level of the technology, the efficiency, and with the increases in battery storage and the decrease in prices for battery storage, the potential for deploying solar is pretty much at arm's length, and it's economical to the point where it outcompetes fossil fuel plants. And now we're faced with, in certain countries, we're faced with, accessibility, land. It takes up a considerable amount of land, so that has to be considered. And it also, in terms of the technological advances, it has gotten rid of some of the previous concerns, which is the impact on the grid. So if it's deployed in the right way, and we always recommend a distributed solar deployment or distributed renewable energy deployment, where it's located at different parts of the country, or the island, and in different parts of the grid. It improves the resiliency, it improves the economics, and it improves the ability for, for example, after a storm, for various segments of the island, if not all, to come back onto the grid rather quickly.
Right. Thank you, David. So what I hear you to be saying is that at this moment, perhaps solar PV as a technology is probably the lowest hanging fruit for us to expedite or accelerate our renewable energy transition. That's what I'm hearing you say. That's exactly what you're hearing. Right. And maybe we heard you from ECCB because that's exactly what we've done, but I could speak to that later. The other issue is that on geothermal, just to say that you mentioned the difficulties. So I know, and Stephanie may speak to that later, I know we've had attempts to bring grant resources to de-risk the resource, to prove the resource before getting into potentially offtake arrangements with the private sector. Because prior to that, governments got into agreements with the private sector who had to raise money. Some of these firms could not raise the money. And assuming they could raise the money, the agreements themselves were very skewed, lopsided in favor of the private sector, which obviously was taking the big risks. And there was an attempt to create more equitable arrangements by getting upfront resources by government to de-risk the resource, to prove the resource, so that when the private sector comes on board, the entity, the partner, there is already a proven resource, and therefore the build-out is less risky. And I know attempts were made, but there have been difficulties. Take St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, which has gone a far way in terms of drilling. The enthalpy is fine, but the challenge now is the permeability of the rock, the rock material. And my understanding is that they are now looking at a particular technology that might be able to address that particular issue. But thank you very much for that perspective, David, on where we are and where we can go. Stephanie, I want to come back to you. Based on some of these challenges that David mentioned, what do you see as some of the key reforms that are needed to support infrastructural investments to really catalyze, to really make a quantum leap in this area of renewable energy and renewable energy transition?
Thanks very much, Governor. And I, as a first point, I do believe that the Caribbean countries have made substantial strides in their reforms. So by and large, the legal and regulatory framework that is necessary to be able to scale up the renewable energy sources is in place. So some adaptation is still needed in the context of rapidly evolving technology and business models and deployment models. And I think Mr. Gumbs alluded to some of these when making a comment about the recommendation of distributed generation models I think in a context of more technological choices associated with specific constraints. But I think this is very relevant in terms of also need to adapt the institutional business model, financing mechanisms, as well as some of the legal and regulatory frameworks to allow for this development of a new distributed generation model, shifting away to what is traditionally a more centralized generation model with transmission lines and then distribution lines. So this is where I see an area of still some effort that would be required. And I think that together with the Rocky Mountain Institute and other partners, there's a lot of technical assistance that can be that is being put on the table and can be further put on the table to help the countries bridge that slight legal and regulatory gap. There's some specifics on the institutional arrangements that may be more complex to overcome. And I think you touched on some of them just now, Governor. I believe that where the electricity sector is within public ownership, there should be a lot of leeway from the government and from the utility to push, to give momentum to such a transition. And then the second part, which is about the financing constraints, becomes the key bottleneck. I think in the region, there's been substantial progress in and success in attracting the private sector and attract private investment and private participation into the electricity sector. And there, in those cases, for instance, where we have exclusive concession rights and where we have a privately owned utility, there needs to be, I think, more thinking on the legal and regulatory framework and working in conjunction, in collaboration with the private partners to identify the incentives that would allow for that shift, given the standing agreements with the private sector. This is not impossible. It has happened in a number of other countries. I think the Caribbean has a scalability and a scale constraint, but that could still be overcome working again hand in hand with the private sector partner. And I think this is some of the institutional angles that I would like to mention. Now, going to the second part of your question, which is about the infrastructure investments that would be needed to catalyze the renewable energy investments. So Mr. Gumbs and yourself have already touched on a few of those. So indeed, in the context of the Caribbean, we have a number of baseline assumptions. We are constrained from a geographic footprint standpoint. So we cannot afford to have the large, say, concentrated solar plants that we're seeing in places such as Morocco or Chile, simply because we don't have a desert in the middle of our land that we can rely on. So this is one. Another aspect is, of course, the weather. And so I think it's, as you know, hinted to by Mr. Gum, I think it's an excellent technological development that now we can install solar PV that can withstand Category 5 hurricanes. This was not the case 10 years ago. So this is a very positive development. And then, so in addition to the resources, so we have some specifics. The region is endowed with large geothermal resources. This is an unprecedented opportunity, but of course it comes with its own share of risks. So when we think of the investments that would be required, I fully agree with maximizing the base load, the geothermal resources that could be accessed. And in respect of this, I fully agree with the need to tap into grant funding, into deeply concessional financing for the de-risking part of the geothermal investment, the exploratory drilling. And as you mentioned, Governor, the World Bank is involved in such financing, for instance, in St. Lucia and in Dominica. The intent is simply what you described, to de-risk the resource, so that when the private sector comes in and looks at the economic potential, the few technical constraints that may remain, they're able to put on the table a proposal for a plant at a cost that remains affordable. That is the most competitive, and that there's sufficient bidders coming in because the data is there. So the de-risking through, you know, wind speed measurement campaigns, generally we simply need to install a few anemometers for a duration of 1 year. This is something that can be financed, the collection of data to assess the wind resource. The geothermal, which is a little riskier in nature, there's several climate funds that are available to do this. And I think the World Bank is very, very happy to continue this effort in helping access those grants. And on the subject of then the distributed business model for instance, solar energy and or wind energy, this is also an effort that would require investments in the grid, but those are well known now, installation of storage at certain points and also adaptation of the operation of the system, of the operation of the network. All those are very well known now. We're benefiting from essentially the lessons learned and the mistakes made by other nations as they moved to those models. And I think there's a lot that we can learn so that we can advance more quickly in the Caribbean countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. David, before I ask the panelists for a comment in the final question, let me just go back to something about grid stability. So I recall 10 years ago, the discussion was, you know, for solar PV, for example, there's a limit to how much the grid can take on. At the time, there was a suggestion, maybe 10, 15%, after which, given the intermittent nature of the resource or the source of energy, there could be grid instability. What is the latest thinking on that? Because you seem to suggest that it has evolved. Where are we on this question of grid stability and solar PV?
Yeah, I think in today's climate, it's a non-issue. Not that there wouldn't be some necessary grid upgrades, but there wouldn't be the substantial upgrades you would have anticipated or needed back some days ago. There was just a limit to how much could be renewable or irregular frequency energy could be put back onto the grid at certain points. So as Mrs. Gill mentioned, you know, with battery technology, you can basically send back clean, stable, renewable energy to the grid from any point, so from any source. Now, depending on the capacity, you may have to upgrade the grid at that particular point or build some transmission lines, depending on the size of the project. But I think, you know, beyond the battery technology that enables that stabilizes that return in energy, you can have it set up in various different ways. So you can set up the generation at multiple points. It's a little more expensive the more points you have, but at multiple points, it reduces the amount of energy coming in at each point. Secondly, you can have essentially, microgrids that can be managed and monitored from a central point. So right now we have a centralized power station. The future of the grid is going to be where you have many different entry points for energy, and you're going to have systems, and there exist systems today that can manage that energy efficiently and effectively to dispatch it from the source to the end user, whether it's a prosumer, consumer, and all the new terminologies that will go with the smart grid of the future.
Right. Could we say a word on this issue of pricing, net billing, net metering? Because to create incentives for people to invest in self-generation, we have to have a clear regulatory framework that includes at what price you're going to, the utility is going to purchase it from, assuming that you propose to sell to the grid. Any views on that?
So that in itself has come a long way. The discussion 10 years ago, was about net billing and a number of different mechanisms that could be used to both incentivize it and make it fair and equitable for all the players, all the stakeholders. That has come a long way in the sense that it's so easy for a consumer to invest in their own generation plan. And naturally, if that's done without the right regulatory mechanisms, that could be something that could lead to challenges for the average consumer or the low-income consumer who cannot invest in their own plant and facilities. So that is still something we have to manage and make sure that the transition happens in a very equitable way. However, there is so much more opportunity and potential to involve persons in the renewable energy transition. And I think this plays out specifically for the Caribbean region and particularly for the ECCU. When you have the challenge of financing, raising the capital to invest in plants, you have the challenge of, scale, where we're a lot of small countries, and one investment in a nationwide initiative, whether it's 4 megawatts, 5 megawatts. I know St Kitts just did a 35 megawatt plant, so kudos to St Kitts for doing that. It really is about scale, so you can get the best pricing. I think some of the potential that exists in our region is that we have people who are highly interested in participating and investing in the transition, but they may not be able to do so on an individual plant-by-plant basis. So I may not be able to spend $15,000 or $20,000 to put a PV system on my roof. However, I can participate in community solar or other initiatives, whether it's through the development of a corporation, and we all participate in investing in that. I think if we can raise $1,000 per person, or per family, or per household, that gives us an incredible momentum to overcome the financial barriers that we typically face with renewable energy transition, participating with utilities who will do their own investment, and maybe other developers or private investors who may come in through a power purchase agreement to sell electricity at an agreed upon rate to the utility. There's so many ways to actually go after this today. I think what we have to do is create the environment that nurtures and encourages sort of the creativity that comes along with it, both in the financial sector and in the energy sector. They go hand in hand. So we can put in all the regulatory requirements on the energy side. Net billing is not a popular course of action, but there are many countries that do feed-in tariffs, where they set a specific rate to cover the cost of generation, where the utility would pay a very specific fixed rate for every kilowatt they receive from one of these plants. That in turn incentivizes people, and I think that rate can be set at a level right now where it's actually beneficial for all parties. And basically they make a return on the investment within 5 years. That's the household. The utility makes a return on that because they avoid buying and purchasing expensive diesel or fuel. And at the same time, the country benefits because you don't have this export of its GDP. The balance of payments come more in tune, which you started out with the Eastern Caribbean states, I think, spending roughly 500 million on
1.2 billion.
1.2 billion on fuel.
Oil imports.
Oil imports, between the generation side, which probably accounts for half of that, and then the transportation side, which accounts for maybe the second half of that. I think, there's so much that could happen to really drive the economics of a renewable energy transition. And I probably don't have enough time to drill down and go deep into how, we sort of envision this happening. But the structures are there, the solutions are there. Right now, it's about packaging that, making sure everyone understands the risk associated with, de-risking it, setting up the enabling environment, both the finance and the energy side, and sort of building a culture where we're changing the entire system to basically modernize it and bring it into a smart grid, multiple energy points, production points, and making it lower cost and more resilient, which is a very important factor in our region.
If I can just add one piece to that, Governor.
Yes, I was going to ask you to comment now, actually. Go ahead.
Thanks. I think there are a couple of things that a couple of missing pieces. In many of our countries, you still have outdated electricity supply acts that govern the management of electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. So, for example, in St. Lucia, although we were able to have an amendment to the Electricity Supply Act, I think in late 2015, that allowed for generation from renewable sources, many countries still have these electricity supply acts that give the incumbent utility company, be it WINLEC, Lucelec, Grenlec in Grenada, a long-term monopoly on the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. So, for example, in St. Lucia, Lucelec's monopoly ends in 2045. That's 24 years from now. So that has to be changed. We really must have some level of reform, legislative reform, to allow for this new era of renewable energy to really take root and not to be governed by the dictates of the utility company. Because right now, the utility company is the one that is setting the pace, or at least managing or regulating the pace at which a lot of this renewable energy uptake can take place. So, for example, in St. Lucia, although we were able to have a National Utilities Regulatory Commission, which is another thing that is missing in many of our jurisdictions, you don't have that arm's length regulation that would give the investor that level of certainty to know that, okay, I'm not left to the whims and fancies of the government or the utility company, that there is an independent regulator that will do things like set tariffs, like determine at what rate the grid grows and how does it grow, how does generation grow. So generation, if we need to, for example, put in an additional, let's say 10 megawatts of generating capacity over the next 3 years, how will that 10 megawatts be deployed? Will it be deployed with new fossil fuel plants, heaven forbid, or will it be deployed with a mixture of solar, both utility scale and distributed generation? When we speak distributed generation, we're talking about on the rooftops of houses, and maybe also wind. So you need to have that independent regulatory authority, and that's not existent in all of our countries. The other thing too, and David spoke to it, is we have to be careful that we don't generate a new class of energy poverty. Because the people who can afford to put in distributed generation, who can afford to put in rooftop solar, are the people who can already afford to pay for their electricity bill. To spend $40,000 to put in solar panels on your roof. First of all, you must have a roof that can accommodate that can hold up $40,000 worth of solar panels. You must have a panel within your house. You must have a wiring system within your house that will allow that to take place. And the average working class person in the Caribbean can't afford it. So we have to be careful that in this transition to energy, we don't create a new class of energy poor, where the people who are benefiting from this transition to energy are the ones really who, I don't want to say least need the benefit, but the ones who really need the benefit are the poor people who paying their energy bill is a massive portion of the income that they bring in. So we have to find somewhere. And I think when David spoke of community solar solar projects. I think that's a good way of approaching it. If we can have, let's say, a microgrid in a poor area where we can say to the people of this area that 150 households in this area, we will zero your bill. So you will not have to worry about your electricity bill for the next 100 years, then I think that will go a long way. And the other point I wanted to make on this very encouraging drop in solar PV pricing and battery storage pricing, to the point where, as Stephanie pointed out, you're now getting 10 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV and battery. We have to watch what that means for geothermal, because the upfront costs of geothermal are quite expensive, and geothermal is also risky, as St. Vincent and the Grenadines found out that even if you have the enthalpy, as you said, permeability might be an issue. In St. Lucia, the corrosiveness of the environment is also an issue, because we have a very acidic environment in St. Lucia that requires an adaptation of the technology that's being used. So if it is that solar PV continues to drop, will it get to the point where, if we can get the land and we have battery storage that can now make solar transition from being intermittent, where you only can use solar when there's sunshine, to the point where you now have battery storage and you could dispatch this solar 24/7, does it get to the point where geothermal now is not an attractive proposition? Because you'd be hard pressed to get geothermal to come in at 10 cents per kilowatt hour. The good thing about geothermal is that geothermal is base load, so you get geothermal all day long. So I think there's some calculations that we have to look at, and we have to ensure that we don't get left behind pursuing one technology where another technology has become so much more attractive that you ask yourself, why should I be spending $100 million in trying to get this geothermal drilling right? Whereas for that price, assuming I can get the land space, both from distributed generation and from utility scale solar, that I can get, and battery storage, I can get a much cheaper price point for solar.
Right, thank you. Very, very pertinent points. Stephanie, yes, in fact, you will have the last word in this segment, so come in now.
Thank you. So thank you very much. It's a really passion, it's a passion of mine, this conversation. So I also wanted to pick up on a number of points. And first, going back, I think, to the important point on the institutional aspects and the legal framework and the standing concessions with the utility. So I also wanted to reiterate the need to work hand in hand with the utilities and with the private sector partner to find a way to enable this transition. This is, in my view, one of the main reasons why, despite the potential, despite the reduction of costs, the progress in delivering on the ground further renewable energy sources has been slow. So there clearly is a bridge to cross and more incentives to put in place to allow for this transition, working again hand in hand with the utilities and with the private sector. I fully agree on what is being said on distributed generation. So first, on the fact that it is, in my view, also the model of the future, and on the need to be extremely cautious in the rollout. I'm going to share, some really scary numbers. So that
you're muted, Stephanie. You're muted. Sorry.
Apologies. I moved my hands too much, and I hit. Yes. Apologies. I was simply saying that on the distributed generation side, that I fully support the model and believe that it's the model of the future. And I'm also extremely concerned about the rollout. And I wanted to share the experience of some other Latin American countries whereby, as mentioned by Dr. Fletcher, so the uptake has been essentially by the wealthier households, which created their own mini grids to sell back to the distribution companies, and this has resulted in a regressive cross subsidy from the average ratepayer of electricity, and including the poorest, towards the wealthiest, the two top deciles, the wealthiest 20% of the households in Brazil, to be specific. We did a comprehensive analysis in several states, and this has been the finding that there was, so this unintended consequence has to be watched carefully. And perhaps it is not necessarily a recommendation, but it's an observation that when energy efficiency mechanisms and financing mechanisms were rolled out, they were started with public buildings and such as state, so government buildings, public schools, public hospitals, and there could be an attempt to start with this model because in this way we wouldn't negatively penalize or rather or unduly benefit the wealthiest categories of the population. So that could be a suggestion. It is not a recommendation. We don't have specific experience on this for rollout of distributed generation. That could be one suggestion. And I think on the point of geothermal, and the relative competitiveness of geothermal versus solar plus battery storage, I think it's, so my perspective is that an energy needs to be an energy mix, and that therefore there would be space for geothermal, there would be space for solar, there would be space for other technologies for demand response, hopefully displacing 100% of fossil fuels. I personally do not believe that we may be in a scenario where we would have 100% of solar plus battery storage. And therefore, I think the planning is a very important exercise. I know that a lot of integrated resiliency and resource planning are being undertaken in the region and consider the technologies and the mix with this lens. And so I wouldn't necessarily, so I do believe that geothermal and other resources are compatible in the context of the diversified electricity mix. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Stephanie. So we're at the top of the hour, 1 hour in, 30 minutes to go. And in case you just joined us, you are listening to ECCB Digital Dialogues. Our topic today is pandemic and climate resilience. And our special focus is on scaling up renewable energy to recover, build resilience, and help transform our region. And so we have with us Dr. James Fletcher, who is the principal owner of Solaricon, a consulting firm, former Minister of Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia, among other things. We have Ms. Stephanie Gill, who is a practice manager for Latin America in respect of energy and extractive industries at the World Bank. And we have Mr. David Gums, who is that principal at Rocky Mountain Institute, deals with islands, Africa, Southeast Asia, and is a former CEO of Anguilla Electricity Company. Those are our panelists, and I am yours truly, Timothy Antwine, Governor, ECCB. At this moment, we're going to park. Thank you very much, panelists. This is the end of segment 1. We're going to move swiftly to our second segment and check in with our poll, and then we will move to the question and answer in our third and final segment. I want to, Stephanie, I'm going to ask you how we could get more money out of the international community to help us with that. So I'm not letting you have the hook. I'm going to come back on that question because we have to find more resources to address this issue. So I hope to get back to that in the Q&A section. But let's go to our poll. And if you're new to this, it's www.menti.com. www.menti.com is our poll. And the access code is 1571. 8357, 1571, 8357. We have 3 questions. Let's go to the questions, please. Question 1. What is the most critical policy action that can be taken to support renewable energy transition in our region? What is the most critical policy action that can be taken to support the renewable energy transition in our region? Ready? We can see people are voting. So 56%, which is the majority, says financial incentives to the private sector for them to bring the investments. 56% financial incentives for the private sector to deliver on the investment. 25% say government investment in renewable energy infrastructure. The government should do more. Government should invest in renewable energy infrastructure. And the 20% of respondents say legislative reform to allow independent power producers. And that goes to the issue of the Electricity Supply Act in several countries which create monopolies, natural monopolies, and which is, of course, a barrier for independent power producers. But of course, as you have heard, there's a challenge, there's a balance there. because you need to make sure that in bringing in, you don't create an issue where you have a regressive, as Stephanie explained in Brazil, where all of a sudden the poor is now subsidizing the rich, or those who have access to the means to do their own microgrids. So it's a delicate balance to be struck. But to be sure, we have to get more competition in where we can. We certainly have to have strong regulatory frameworks. So the read at this moment on question 1, the majority say more incentives for the private sector to bring renewable energy investments. Just about 30% of you now say legislative support from governments for independent power producers. 25% say government should invest in renewable energy infrastructure. That's question 1. Thank you very much. The poll will remain open. Let's move to question 2. Question 2 says, what renewable energy source or resource do you think holds the greatest potential for development in our region? What renewable energy resource do you think holds the greatest potential for development in our region? So this is ECCU specific. And the respondents so far, 84%, 85% say solar PV. So there's a very strong statement being made here by respondents. Of all the renewable energy resources at our disposal, 86% say it is solar PV. That's our dominant or principal source. 10% say geothermal. 3% say biomass. And 3% say wind. We didn't offer hydro there, but of course there are a couple countries, as was mentioned earlier, Dominica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that offer hydro. Although with lower rainfall these days, hydro becomes a little more problematic than it used to be. So second question, what renewable energy resource do you think holds the greatest potential for development in our region? And 87% of you say solar PV. That is the lowest hanging fruit. That's where we should invest heavily. Of course, not only, 11% say geothermal, 3% say biomass, 3% say wind. Thank you very much. The poll remains open, so you can keep responding. Question 3, please. Question 3. What would be your greatest motivation? What would be your greatest motivation for transitioning to renewable energy? What would be your greatest motivation for transitioning to renewable energy? So far, 73% of respondents say energy cost savings. I want to cut my energy bill. Energy cost savings. 27% says improving the environment, lowering our carbon footprint or emissions. And, well, 0% actually says energy. Well, no, 2% says energy security. So the question is, what is your greatest motivation for wanting to move to renewable energy? And no surprise, 70% of respondents at this moment say to lower our energy bill, the cost of energy. And of course, we know this, not just at the household level, but at the level of the private sector, at business, where the cost of doing business, inclusive of energy, is high. 25% thereabouts say to help the environment. So we are conscious, we want to lower emissions, but the driving reason is an economic reason. And that's not surprising in this part of the world, as in many parts of the world, actually. And then there's the issue of energy security. So that's it, the 3 questions. You can continue to go to the poll. And when I come back into the Q&A in a minute, if the panelists wish to react to any of these poll results, they can do that. But I want to thank you for participating in our audience poll. And now we move to the third and final segment, or Q&A, question and answer. Question and answer. If you're just joining us, you are listening to ECCB Digital Dialogues. Our topic today is pandemic and climate resilience, and our special focus is on scaling up renewable energy to help us recover, build resilience, and transform our region. Now to the questions. So the first question that I see on screen says, as part of a broader recycling program to reduce the amount of waste going into landfills, would there be much scope for biomass as a source of energy production in our region? How feasible is biomass for the islands or countries of the ECCB? Who would like to take this one?
Can take a stab at it. I think this is an interesting question. Biomass is very viable, and it is a practical solution for the region. One of the things that we do have to worry about in the region is that I've seen a recent study about a couple of years ago that suggests that per capita, we do have a high heavy carbon footprint in the region on a per capita basis. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, we're 0.002 or something like that of global emissions. But we're a high tourism sector. Tourism brings a lot of imports and a lot of product, and we do know that we import a lot of product in this region. I think one of the things that we do have to be concerned about is where does that product go? I am very knowledgeable about specific islands that do have a challenge today in where they put those products or the waste. And, although they're different, when you say biomass, you have different solutions out there. But if we focus on the waste to energy solutions, that is a viable solution. I don't think it applies to every country. And there are a lot of challenges that has to be mitigated in that sector of energy production. However, it is a practical and very necessary solution for certain countries, because these are things you can't export, and it will cost you so much more to export. You can convert a lot of the waste into energy. So the islands that are challenged with a waste, that do have a waste challenge, where they have landfills that are overfilled and are causing disruption to health and pollution, in the sense that there are fires that are, they're catching on fire every so often. I think to implement an effective waste management solution, I think energy must be one of those considerations.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, Governor. When I was the Minister of Energy, we actually did a waste study, because waste to energy was an issue that was very important for us. We had two landfills, one that was very close to the end of its life cycle, and another one that was not too far away from its life cycle. And St. Lucia doesn't have very many areas that are just jumping at you and saying, convert me into a landfill. So you can't continue just decommissioning and commissioning new landfills ad infinitum. So it's important that you find some waste to energy solution. What we found, however, was that there just was not sufficient municipal waste for the technologies that were available to make waste to energy economically viable. Waste to energy, however, was environmentally necessary. So I think that's a discussion that the government needs to have, because are you implementing waste to energy as an energy generating solution? If it is in many of our jurisdictions, as David said, it's not economically viable. But if you're implementing it as an environmental solution, and you understand that you cannot continue just commissioning new landfills with all of the hazards that come with that, so therefore you need to put a subsidy into having a waste to energy plant that, yes, you get some energy out of it, but really what you're doing is trying to have a zero landfill policy. Then I think when you put in that environmental calculus, then it makes waste to energy something that is absolutely necessary.
Right. I fully agree with you on that, because the cost of expanding landfills or building new landfills is astronomical. I mean, if you see the cost of building a cell, it's crazy. So there has to be a way to reduce our waste, as you pointed out, perhaps managing the waste energy differently. So thanks for that feedback. Let's move to some more questions. Basic question, is renewable energy reliable? Who wants to take that? Is renewable energy reliable?
I think from all of us, that would be a resounding yes. It's proven. There's so many different technologies. We talked about the potential for solar, wind, and geothermal. It's very viable, and it's happening. And it's something that, you know, irregardless of how we feel about it, this is something that is happening naturally, because when it becomes less expensive, it just happens. And there's going to become a point, for example, you know, what's happening in the auto industry. A lot of the automakers are saying we're going to solely produce electric vehicles starting in 2025 and 2030 and so forth. So there's a natural progression that happens in any industry, and it will happen in this industry also.
Right. Thank you. So let me just add, and I'm going to answer one question. I just saw a question saying, what's the role of ECCB in this? So I will tell you two things. First of all, I can attest, we can give a testimonial about the reliability of renewable energy. The ECCB invested just about 1 megawatt in energy, solar PV, and we're now generating about 60% of our energy needs. And that is without storage, which is we're going to come to in due course. Our ambition as a central bank is to ensure that our campus is carbon neutral by 2022. So we put that out in our strategic plan, and we are working towards that. We've made 2 investments, which is essentially solar canopies over our car parks. That has allowed us to get to 60%. And then we plan to do a couple other things. And we are now doing the EE stuff. So normally you start with EE, but we knew EE could not deliver that ambition. So we went big, bold, early. We're now doing the EE stuff, the energy efficient things inside the buildings with our LED and our air conditioning and so on. That will probably get us hopefully to 80%, and then the storage will probably take us to 100. That's the general plan, the quick outline. What is the role of ECCB? Very simple. 1, advocacy. And so we use our platform, we use our voice. I use my voice in this office to articulate, advocate for our region around the world in terms of bringing resources to support us with building resilience, both on the adaptation side and the resilient and the mitigation side. Secondly, moral example. That's why we made the investment. It's good for our bottom line, yes. We save, for example, $1.2 million now on our electricity bill as a result. It's good for the environment. But very importantly, it empowers us to make the argument wherever we go, to call out large emitters of greenhouse gases. If small islands like the ECCU, if a small central bank like the ECCB can make this example, make this investment, you should do more. Shame on you, you must do more. And so what is the role of ECCB? Advocacy, but also example, moral authority. Use our platform to do that. And what we want to see is a scaling up. So we've done it on a campus, but we want now to see a scaling up in our member countries. And that's the subject of this particular dialogue today. So I just answered that question as well. Let's go back to the Q&A box. What do we have? So someone is asking, what has been the main obstacle to legislative and regulatory reform to allow for selling excess electricity back to the grid or the utility company? What has been the main obstacle? And the question is being raised because there are challenges in some member countries with self-generators not feeling able to make the investment and sell back. Any takers on that? Dr. Fletcher, do you want to comment on that?
I think what is important, and Stephanie pointed it out when she was speaking, is that you must do this in partnership with the utility company. This will not work if you have an antagonistic relationship between the government and the utility company. The utility company has the force of legislation behind it. The utility company has been mandated by statute to do the things that it has done. And so for you to now cause that uptake of renewable to take place, it means that you have to break existing laws. When I say break, I'm short. You have to reform existing laws. You have to change the electricity supply acts in many of these countries. But you have to do that with the cooperation of the utility company, or at least in dialogue with the utility company. If not, then you can find yourself in a situation as one of our member states found itself in, where you now end up in court, and it can be a very messy litigious process, which doesn't help anyone. And that's one of the things that we did in St. Lucia very early, was that we engaged with Lucelec. Some people felt that we shouldn't have, that we should have gone full steam ahead and told Lucelec what it is that we plan on doing. But we felt that we would not get anywhere that way, that the utility company had to see some benefit for itself in this. And we also brought on, well, Rocky Mountain Institute, and before that, the Carbon War Room, to work with the utility company so that they could now develop a new business case, so they could see how they could now profit in a new environment, because you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. In all of our countries, we have utility companies. Many of them are owned by, if not by the government, are owned basically by the country, operated by, managed by citizens of the country. Those profits come back to the country. So you don't want to dismantle your utility companies, but you want them to understand that they must now operate in a new environment. So I think working with the utility company, but also having government will. The government must see this as something that is important for it to do. And that has not always been the case in some of our jurisdictions. So there's a combination of government will to do it, but also working with the utility company to get it done. And that's why I want to go back to the first question. I know many people said that financial incentives to the private sector are the most important, and I agree with them. But up to a point, in St. Lucia, for example, we have a private sector, particularly our hotel sector, that is chomping at the bits to put on solar PV panels on their hotels, because their utility bills are high. The problem is, under the existing legislation, they can put on no more than 25 kilowatts of solar panels. Now, for a medium to a large hotel, a 25 kilowatt solar panel installation does nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. So it really is not worth it for them. So I think the legislation and the incentives must go hand in hand, because if you're not going to allow me to generate at a level that will allow me to bring down my utility costs to something where I can see some benefit, then why invest in a 25 kilowatt facility for my roof? So that's why, you know, the legislation is important, government will is important, but working with the utility companies, because if the utility company digs its heels in and says we're not doing anything because we have been mandated by statute to do what we've done, then you're in for a tough battle.
Yeah, now that's a real issue in many of our countries. You mentioned several. I haven't cited Grenada, but obviously I'm familiar with that example there. A utility company under Electricity Supply Act, monopoly until 2080, I believe, 2080. And of course, many of you would have heard of the recent repurchase by the government of Grenada of the utility company after, I guess, 26 years or whatever of that arrangement. Still meant that they had another 54 years left on that monopoly. It's a difficult one. You want to collaborate where you can. If there's goodwill on both sides, that's the ideal way to go. If not, it gets very difficult, litigious, and expensive. By the end of the day, the governments also have to play a role, as you said, in moving forward with the agenda. I recall as PS Energy wanted to put some solar panels on some rural households in a part of Grenada, and had to get permission to do that. Those are grants, but had to get permission. The government had to go and beg for permission to do that. It's not a comfortable situation for the state either. You want to be able to lower the cost, because all of our governments see this barrier to business and investment, that is a high cost of energy. Stephanie alluded to it at the top, 40% US cents per kilowatt hour. How do you bring investors to this region with that energy bill looming, that energy cost? So we have to lower the trajectory, but we have to do so in a very collaborative and a calibrated way to the extent that we can. Well, we're almost out of time, and I want to return to the question, Stephanie. How do we get more out of the international community to help us bring the requisite resources for renewable energy? And then I'm going to ask each panelist for their final comments. Stephanie?
Thank you, Governor. So I think there's a lot of interest from the financing community, from the donor community to support this energy transition in the Caribbean. If I take simply the example of the World Bank, which I think is illustrative, the commitments to the region for the IDA concessional resources have multiplied fourfold from our previous funding cycle to this funding cycle, looking at $500 million. there's a lot of willingness and a lot of cash available. I think also that this is amplified with the current refocus on the importance of climate change. And so what the difficulty, therefore, is more on how to access this capital that is available for the region. And the access to financing is a difficult nut to crack because of some of the elements that have been mentioned by Dr. Fletcher and by Mr. Gomes, in particular the issue of scale. And we've touched on this both for the distributed generation model. And in addition to this discussion that we've had, therefore, on supporting the transition of the legal framework, implementing the necessary regulatory changes to allow for distributed generation, there's also this issue of accessing the large scale of financing that is available, both concessional and grant, to make it available for the investments. And there, talking of ECCB's leadership by example, I do think that there would be an interest in considering a regional approach to this scale up, to attract the private sector, to help them come in through some incentives, be it grant financing, concessional financing, guarantee instruments, that could help materialize the scale up. We want to go beyond the very successful pilots that have been implemented in a large number of countries. And so I do believe that the financing is on the table and that it is really about the mechanism to access it. And perhaps taking a regional view and having a regional effort that doesn't need to have all of the countries joined together in the first place, but perhaps a subset that would take the lead and then allow for the replication, perhaps using the recipe of the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which was very successful and could be perhaps seen as a model to replicate for, again, this purpose of accessing the capital that is there.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very good. I'm glad you mentioned that we should pursue that conversation. Without saying too much more, I would say to the public that the ECCB and the World Bank are engaged on an initiative where we are looking to see whether we could find a way to do a dedicated renewable energy facility for the ECCU. We'll not say more on that now. Let's work it, and then when we have more to say, we'll say that. But we do want to bring the resources to bear. Panelists, your final thoughts, 1 minute each, starting with you, Dr. Fletcher. You're muted. Dr. Fletcher, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, that happens.
Right.
The world is moving in a particular direction. I think all of the borrowing all of the multilateral development banks, the World Bank and others, have agreed to align their policies with the Paris Agreement. So this is something that is happening. And I think even if our countries want to pursue a high carbon development pathway, they will find that the level of funding available for that business as usual scenario will reduce, and they will be forced to go in the direction of a low carbon development pathway. The sooner we get on board with this, the better. We have to now start ensuring that we change our approach. I still haven't seen that level of change of thinking in our countries that is required. We haven't used this point of inflection that COVID provided to us for us to change our thinking, and that's necessary. And I'm very pleased with the leadership that the ECCB is showing, and what you just said, they excites me even more. But I think we need to now start moving in that direction, and we need to do it in a concerted, coordinated manner. And just one little thing I want to point on electric vehicles. The vehicle market in the Caribbean didn't move until we got to the point of used vehicles coming in. I still do not believe that even if we make the changes to tariffs and import duties and excise taxes, we will get the electric mobility market to move in the direction that it needs to move. It will move in that direction when we get a trade in used electric vehicles coming in, when people can go on the internet and buy an electric vehicle for $5,000 and bring it into the Caribbean. So we have to prepare for that. We have to put that charging infrastructure in place. So there are many things that we need to do to prepare ourselves for that low carbon environment. And that's why I would like to see us step up our game, because we're not just moving into a digital environment, we're moving into a low carbon environment, and we need to position ourselves to get the money to make this happen.
Right, right. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, and again for your passion and leadership in this very important issue. David, Mr. Gums?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the dialogue this morning. You know, I must say, you know, we went from challenges to possibilities and solutions, and you know, we recognize that there's still you know, a huge challenge ahead of us making the transition happen. We talked about the regulatory environment, the financial constraints, and so forth, but there is a way, and it is viable, and those countries that really want to make that transition happen, it can be mapped out. There are a number of countries who have made their commitments. We're going to be, you know, 30%, 60%, and some 100% renewable by X date. For many of the countries in the ECCU had 2020 targets. As you mentioned in your opening, they've missed many of those targets. They've been reset to 2030 and 2050. But we're going to be challenged getting there. It's a big haul making that significant transition happen. For a small island, even you could do a 10 megawatt project. That could be one project that takes you, you know, halfway there. However, you know, the land resource and the financial resource to make it happen is still a challenge. So there's going to be a combination of ways and things that need to happen to make it happen. I think the first step, as everyone else mentioned, is creating that enabling environment, both in the regulatory structure so that people can feel safe making those substantial investments. And I think we also, from a financial perspective, we not only need to bring additional resources to the table from multilateral organizations, or some of Anguilla, for example, has a relationship with the UK, and some of the other islands have, you know, relationships with European countries and US countries that can draw on some of those resources. But beyond that, I think we can do this ourselves. I think there is a significant amount of potential that is locked in, and we just need to create that environment. And I think maybe ECCB can play a role in helping to reform and structure that so that the average individual can actually invest in not their system at their facility, but, you know, we could create sort of financial markets to make them, give them the ability to invest in a community system or someone else's system. Here in Maryland, where I'm currently based, you know, I can invest in a system that belongs to somebody completely different, and I can get the credit offset at my house. So there's so many different things we can do to make this happen. I think we just need to work together. Like you mentioned, Dr. Fletcher, we need to work together. Utility needs to sit down at the table, government needs to sit down at the table, and we bring in the community stakeholders, and we can all make this happen efficiently and effectively.
Right, right. Thank you, David. Stephanie?
Thank you, Governor, and also to reiterate my appreciation, it was really excellent, an excellent level of dialogue, and I very much appreciated to be part of this excellent panel. So thanks again for the invitation. And I wanted to reiterate also some of the messages and convey a sense of urgency. So we have an opportunity. We're looking at an economic rebound for this year. It looks like tourism is slow to come back, unfortunately, because we're seeing variants coming up. So for economies that are dependent to a large extent to tourism, there is a drastic need to rethink the economic model and to reduce this $1.2 billion bills in imported fossil fuels. And I do believe that, so there's an important message on leadership. And so I'm very grateful to the ECCB for this leadership by example. I think that the prime ministers of the countries also are very aware and very interested. Perhaps there's a further effort that can be done from the overall community. So you know, RMI, other donors, the Europeans, to come together and explain the role that renewable energy can play in this transition, this economic transition. It's not simply for energy, it is really for this renewal to a more sustainable growth model. And I think one of the elements that will be critical will be this leadership from the top, and we again very much appreciate the example that is put forth by the ECCB. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And let me just say we value the partnership with the World Bank, you and your colleagues, and we will continue to work very collaboratively on this very important subject. Folks, our time is up. Sorry we couldn't get more of the questions, but our time is up. Let me thank all of you who've joined us today, wherever you are in the region and around the world. Special thanks to our panelists for their passion, for their insights, and for their work on this very, very important issue. I do want to, of course, thank our team at the ECCB, Dr. M.F. Soda, the coordinator of the series, who works out of the governor's office, Elizabeth Whalen, of course, who was on our Facebook page monitoring, Sherman Kirby, Director for Corporate Relations, Carissa St. Just, also of our GO in the governor's office, Marlon Davis, Marlon Bristol, Shauna Daniel, Karina Phillips Summersall, and Lyndon Jackasol on the Multimedia, and anyone, Shafari Challenger. Shafari, I haven't seen you in a minute. That's why I had to mispronounce. Sorry about that. Shafari Challenger from our MIS Management Information Services Department. To all of our colleagues around the ECCB team, I'm proud of you. You continue to work hard in this period for our region. Thank you very much, everyone. To the people of our region, I ask you to continue to stay safe. We're still in a pandemic, and stay engaged as we together